Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I do want to thank everybody for joining me. What we're trying to do is roll out a little bit of short subject training. And UMA just seems to be one of those things that everybody seems to have a question with. We monitor it regularly, and it seems to present a few issues that we see over and over. So what we thought we would do is create a short training session. It's going to give you a lot of information about why UMA is available, how we use it, sort of the common issues that appear, how to resolve those issues, and then we'll give you some time at the end to do a little Q&A. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first question that you might have is, why do you have universal material acceptance requirements? Otherwise, we call this UMA. We are at a place in Site Manager and eventually AASHTOWare where all of the material requirements are going to be documented within the system. We're trying to keep all of that information confined into the system rather than having materials documented outside of Site Manager. We use UMA to record materials that are not recognized as unique materials in Site Manager. For example, materials that have been newly introduced. UMA requirements, as I said before, replace the paper DR12 form, and this helps us keep everything recorded in Site Manager, and it eliminates the need for you to keep up with extraneous paper, having to load information into OnBase, those sorts of things. So we'll talk a little bit about universal material requirements. We'll start with material requirements. They're contract line items that are defined by, our contract material line items are defined by standard material requirements. These standards are a general set of materials that we would expect to find on a contract line item. When contracts are let, Site Manager staff will generate materials in accordance with the contract line items that are present. Once we generate those materials, we do an overview to ensure that what the material requirements look like are appropriate to the line item. Because those contract line items are generated, oftentimes they reuse the same ones, but sometimes they create new ones. What we're trying to do is make sure that the materials that are linked to a contract line item are appropriate. So what does this have to do with UMA? What that means for you is if a line item calls for a material that is undefined, and for example, if we look at item code A07971, that's for terminated fiber connector. This fiber connector is not a unique material in Site Manager. So what will happen is we'll assign UMA requirements to that line item for terminated fiber connector. We also assign it to things called automated gate, anything where we do not have an existing unique material or set of material requirements. You're going to see UMA on that contract line item. Occasionally, we'll find an item description that doesn't provide us with enough information to define materials. Sometimes you'll see a requirement, a line item on your contract for something called additional work. It's difficult for us to define at the outset what additional work means to you. So because we cannot define what those material requirements might be, sometimes you'll find UMA assigned to that particular line item. So we want you, the other thing that before we move on to that, what do you think about UMA? You might find that sometimes the specials or the change orders might provide you with additional information. So and we'll get to how we can arrange that, but know that sometimes we don't get all the information that we need in order to adequately assign material. So your next question is oftentimes is, do I have the proper requirements? So if on your particular contract you ended up with an item code for a fiber connector, you know and I know that we don't have a unique material called fiber connector. So in this case, yes, UMA, universal material, is the appropriate material to be assigned to that particular line item. If, on the other hand, you have a requirement for additional work, know that we're going to rely on you, since you have plans in hand, to recognize what that additional work entails. Sometimes it might be for a material that is known to site manager. Say it's for pipe or for reinforcing steel or for concrete work. In that case, we can update the material requirements for that particular line item and improve the material requirements so that you get the materials that you need. So what do I need to know before I start? Before you start documenting a universal material item, you'll need to know what you're submitting for consideration. What is the material you're trying to document in Site Manager? You'll want to know what line item you're trying to satisfy. That you'll get from your sampling checklist, from your contract line items. Just, we want to know what line item we're trying to satisfy. You'll want to know whether or not you've reviewed your sampling checklist. Are your materials defined in your requirements? And finally, have you reviewed your required documents list? Your materials required documents list is generated at the outset of a contract, at the outset of a project. Dave Hall prepares those for us. And it identifies for you acceptance methodology and the responsible lab. Now, these elements are going to be important when we get to creating a sample record so that you know what lab to assign the item to and what acceptance method to choose. So, from here, let's look at building a sample record. So these are the things that are you'll basically want to know when you get started. If you're going through when you're starting to create a sample record, when you enter the Site Manager sample record, you'll start on the Basic Sample Data tab. The required fields on the Basic Sample Data tab call for a material. You'll select UMA. For the producer supplier, you'll identify a producer supplier not listed. For where we started. On the Basic Sample Data tab, the items that you're going to need to be aware of when you're creating the sample record. A UMA sample record is created like every other sample record. These are the required fields. The material value, universal material, the producer supplier, and the product name. Both of these you're going to get a general designation of producer supplier not listed, which is an indicator to you that you'll need the producer supplier not listed template. The product name, which is acceptance method tracking, because that's what we're using UMA for. The intended use, although not a required field, it's valuable information because it will allow you to, it's an indicator for you so that you know what this material actually represents, where it's being used, how it's being used, those sorts of things. And the representative quantity, you're going to get the general value of each. It may not be exactly appropriate, but we're using this UMA to document materials. Other tabs that you're going to want to visit when you're creating a sample record for UMA. Although not required, you're welcome to visit the additional sample data tab. You can provide us with information about sample size, station and offset, reference information. This is additional information that you can use to track this material back. The contract tab, this is always someplace that you want to stop in order to get credit for this sample so that it is linked to your material. This contract tab is how you get credit on your contract for documenting this material. When you visit the contracts tab, you're going to be presented with each line item on your particular contract that has universal material requirements on it. But know that you're only going to want to make a selection of one contract line item or like items so that we can document only those things, because we're really only going to want to document one material per sample record. If you've got multiple universal materials that you're going to want to create sample records for, those are going to be on there, each on a unique sample record. So when you visit the contracts tab, choose either the line item you're trying to satisfy or the like line item that you're trying to satisfy. The test tab. Now this is where it starts to get interesting. The sampling checklist is going to define for you two things: the universal material submission and the producer-supplier submission. But think about what else it is you'll need to document in order to satisfy the requirements for universal material. The thing that's missing is acceptance methodology. And acceptance methodology is often the wild card. We do not know in advance when the materials are generated for your project what the acceptance methodology for that material might be. So how do you know how acceptance is defined? You can go look at your plan, you can look at your specials, or you can look at that required documents list, because those are the items that are always going to define for you what acceptance methodology is going to be for your particular material. So if, for example, we were back to our example of fiber connector, your required documents list is going to identify for you what the acceptance methodology is. So what you're going to want to choose from the available acceptance methods are, you can choose from visual verification, approved products list, certificate of compliance, certificate of test, sample and test. You guys are all familiar with what those acceptance methods mean and how they work. And if you've got questions about that, we can certainly address those. But most of this audience should be familiar with what those acceptance methodologies represent. Know that there is also potential for multiple methods of acceptance. Sometimes you'll see on your required documents list or in your specials that acceptance is by certificate of compliance and certificate of test. So in that case, you're going to want to include two different acceptance methodologies on your sample record. I can stop here for questions if anybody has questions they've got at this time before we continue to go on. Sorry, Ashley, that popped up and went away real quick. Hold on. Okay, Ashley. The acceptance method, yeah. The acceptance method is a test template that you're going to want to add on the test tab. So you'll have no fewer than 3 test methods, test templates on your test tab. You're going to have your universal material submission. You'll have your producer-supplier submission. And then in accordance with what's on your required documents list, you'll have your acceptance method. Does that help? Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. So So once you've created your sample record, you've completed all the information on the basic sample data tab, the contract tab, and the test tab. What else do you need to know? When you return back to your test tab, you'll want to complete the actual completion, give us the actual completion date on the Universal Materials Submission template and the producer-supplier submission. Returning to the basic sample data tab, you'll want to give us the status of either ready for review, and occasionally you'll choose complete. What that does is it helps indicate to us that you're done with the record submission so that we know whether or not we can assign it to the specific lab. And oftentimes we get questions about whether or not we should be authorizing a sample record. By and large, these sample records should remain in a ready for review status. This gives the labs the opportunity to review your documentation, review your material submission, evaluate what you're submitting for review, and then when the lab is finished with their review, when they're finished with their evaluation, they will authorize the record. There are occasions when authorizing a record is acceptable, and that's really in cases where your material acceptance method is by visual verification. And you could argue that APL is also a condition where a record could be authorized, but since all of the APL materials are recognized materials in Site Manager, it would be highly unusual for you to choose your acceptance method of approved products and on a Universal Materials Submission record. So what happens next? After you've submitted your sample, after you've completed your Universal Materials Submission record, your sample record, what happens next? Generally, you'll get an email the very next day. It's an email that's automated by our system, and it's going to give you information about the condition of that sample record. If there's something missing, if there's an issue, it's going to be identified in that email that's been sent to you. And it will tell you, it will give you, it will direct you to the item that's causing an issue. So for example, if you only create a sample record that has the Universal Materials Submission template and the producer-supplier submission, but you don't have an acceptance method, it's going to identify that you're missing an acceptance method. If you add that producer-supplier submission and the Universal Materials Submission, but you don't fill the templates out, it's going to tell you that you're missing information on those templates. If the record's been authorized inappropriately, it's going to point that out for you. Know that on a daily basis, the site manager staff get a copy of that automated email, and we review them on a daily basis. Generally, you'll get a follow-up email from one of us here offering assistance, asking, helping you to identify the issue that's with your sample record. Sometimes we'll send you a copy of the quick reference guide. We'll try and do our best to offer assistance so that you can get your Universal Materials records completed and moving forward. When you put your sample record in a ready for review status, the lab's been notified. And the lab that gets the notification is based on the lab ID that you've added on the test tab. Why is that important? Well, the lab that should be identified on your test tab is the lab that corresponds with the responsible lab on your required documents list. So if you're submitting a steel item, that's material that's going to be evaluated by the physical test lab. If you're submitting an aggregate item, that's a material that's going to be evaluated by our ag lab. So it's important that you direct the sample records to the appropriate lab, so that the lab can get their notification that this is awaiting their evaluation. On a weekly basis, every Monday, we have a report that's generated to us here, and we look at all of the outstanding UMA sample records. If a UMA sample record is outstanding and it appears to have all the pieces of the puzzle, the materials have been identified, the producer supplier identified, and the acceptance method identified, we'll forward those on to the responsible lab so that they can make sure that they follow up and evaluate your records. If there's a piece of the puzzle that's still missing, we don't forward those sample records on for evaluation, but oftentimes we'll reconnect with you, the sample record creator, to see if there's something that we can do to provide assistance. We'll confirm that the lab assignment has been made correctly, those sorts of things. We just take a quick look and make sure that your UMA sample record is in a proper status so that it can be evaluated. And sometimes we'll follow up. And because I do this generally every Monday, and sometimes I forget what I do from one Monday to the next, I may contact you more than once and ask you the same question. So for that, I apologize. You'll just have to bear with me. So from here, that's really what I've got in terms of presentation. So I'm going to open up the